You felt it, the shift you can't quite explain. Nothing in your home looks different. The same doorway. The same kitchen light. The same hallway you've walked 1,000 times. And yet, the air doesn't land the way it used to. Conversations turn sharp over nothing. A small comment becomes a spark. Someone shuts down, someone snaps back, and suddenly you're standing in the aftermath wondering, why did that get so big? Then night comes. A child calls out from a dream they can't describe. You wake with your heart already running. The quiet doesn't feel restful, just watchful. Even the good moments have a thin edge to them, like peace keeps slipping through your fingers right when you reach for it. And you've tried to explain it away, because that's what we do. It's the schedule. It's the bills. It's the season. It's the stress. It's just December. So you pray. You push worship music a little louder. You tell yourself it'll pass after the holidays. But the atmosphere stays off. Here's the part nobody likes to say out loud: sometimes the problem isn't what's happening to your home. It's what's been happening in your home, quietly, slowly, while everyone assumed the walls were enough to keep everything out. Because not every invasion kicks down a door. Some things enter the way cold enters, through a thin gap you stopped noticing. A grudge you never finished dealing with. A habit you keep excusing because it's not that bad. A tone you've normalized. A compromise you learned to live with. A doorway you forgot was a doorway, because it's familiar, because it's routine, because no one ever taught you that spiritual pressure often starts at the threshold, not the altar. And now we're in that stretch of time that always feels ordinary until it isn't, from now until Christmas. Not just a countdown. Not just shopping and lights and calendars. A narrowing. Because the closer the season of light gets, the more aggressively darkness tries to sour the place where light is supposed to live, your peace, your relationships, your rest. If it can't stop the celebration, it will try to poison the atmosphere around it. If it can't silence your faith, it will try to exhaust you until faith feels like effort instead of authority. That's why the tension is louder lately. That's why small things feel heavy. That's why the house can look the same and still feel like something has moved in. And here's the provocation, the thing modern people roll their eyes at until they're desperate enough to listen. Salt is not just seasoning. It's not a superstition. Not a cute ritual. Not folklore dressed up as faith. In the older language of covenant, in the kind of faith that understands boundaries, salt is a marker. A refusal. A line drawn where decay does not get to spread. A physical no placed into ordinary space. And there are 7 spots in a home where that no matters more than most people realize, especially in this season. 7 locations where the atmosphere tends to leak first. 7 places that quietly function like gates, whether you meant them to or not. I'm not telling you this to make you paranoid. I'm telling you because you're not crazy for sensing the shift, and you're not powerless either. From now until Christmas, you don't have to wait and hope your home goes back to normal. You can respond with intention. You can mark what belongs to peace. You can stop treating your house like neutral ground. Because neutrality is a myth in a world where thresholds exist. So if you're listening and thinking, this is probably for someone else, Be careful, those are the exact words that keep people passive while pressure builds. And if you're listening and thinking, I don't know what to do, good. That means you're ready for something practical. In a moment, I'll walk you through the 7 placements, like moving room to room with a map, so this isn't abstract, and it isn't guesswork. But first, you need to understand why this works at all, why something as simple as salt can become a boundary when used with intention, and why our generation forgot what earlier believers treated as basic wisdom. Because I didn't learn this from a trendy clip or a comment thread. I learned it the slow way, through old pages, old practices, and old accounts of people who understood that faith wasn't only spoken, it was enforced. And that's where my story begins. Quick moment, subscribe now. It helps the channel grow and guarantees you never miss the next release. Not in a sanctuary. Not at a conference. Not in some dramatic moment with lights and shouting and a crowd holding its breath. It began in a quiet season when I didn't have the language for what was happening, only the symptoms. You know that feeling when you keep telling yourself you're fine, but your body doesn't believe you? When you move through your own rooms like you're borrowing them, like you're not fully at home in your own home. That was me. At first, I did what everyone does. I blamed the obvious things. Work. Sleep. The constant noise of the world pressing in. I tried to outpray it in the way I had been taught, more effort, more volume, more spiritual activity. I spoke the right words. I played the right songs. I stayed busy enough that I didn't have to admit the truth. But the atmosphere didn't shift. And that's the part that finally forced me to stop and look closer, because when you've done everything right and the heaviness stays, it either means you're imagining things or you're dealing with something you were never trained to recognize. The home didn't feel possessed. It felt contested. Like peace was present, but it was being crowded. Like joy still existed, but it had to squeeze through narrow spaces. Like every good moment came with a thin layer of resistance, subtle enough to ignore if you wanted to, constant enough to exhaust you if you didn't. So I started paying attention. Not to the big moments, the little ones. The way irritation rose too fast. The way apologies felt harder than they should. The way silence lingered after conversations, not peaceful, but heavy, like the room was holding onto something. The way certain corners of the house felt colder at night, not by temperature, but by tone. And then the pattern sharpened. It wasn't random. It wasn't evenly distributed. It was concentrated around thresholds. The doorway where everyone came in carrying the day with them, stress, resentment, temptation, fear. The hallway where arguments started. The bedroom where rest should have been automatic and instead felt interrupted. The kitchen where words should have nourished and instead sometimes cut. You can ignore patterns for a long time if you call them moods. You can excuse them if you call them just life. But there's a moment when your spirit leans forward and says, this isn't just life. This is a pressure. And pressure has a source. I didn't want that to be true. I didn't want to be that person who saw spiritual warfare behind every inconvenience. I didn't want to turn my faith into superstition or paranoia. So I made a deal with myself. I would not dramatize it. I would investigate it. I started where I always start when something doesn't make sense, by tracing it backwards. Back through habits. Back through routines. Back through the unseen agreements we make without realizing we've made them. Because here's the uncomfortable thing, most spiritual breaches aren't created by one massive failure. They're created by small permissions. A little bitterness that never gets confessed because it feels justified. A harmless indulgence that you keep because it numbs you. Entertainment you wouldn't openly defend, but you keep anyway because it's familiar. A relationship you keep tolerating even though it consistently leaves residue on your peace. A tone you use in your home that you would never use in public, but you excuse because they know what I mean. And slowly, without anyone naming it, the home becomes porous. Not because the walls are weak. Because the boundaries are. That was the first truth I had to face. I kept asking God to bring peace into a space I wasn't willing to guard. And guarding is not the same thing as worrying. Guarding is decisive. It's deliberate. It's ownership. Worry watches the door all night and never locks it. Guarding locks it, then sleeps. So I went looking for the kind of faith that knows how to lock doors. Not metaphorically. Practically. That search didn't start with a trend. It didn't start with a flashy teacher. It started with old writings, quiet, stubborn voices from people who lived in harsher conditions than we do and still refused to let their dwellings become open territory. I found them the way you find anything hidden in plain sight, by reading what most people skim and taking seriously what modern comfort has taught us to dismiss. The first time it clicked, it wasn't even dramatic. I was reading about how early believers treated ordinary life. How they approached meals, sleep, speech, work, not as neutral activities, but as places where the soul is either strengthened or thinned. And then I came across a repeated idea that felt almost offensive in its simplicity. A home must be claimed. Not assumed. Not hoped for. Claimed. They didn't talk about houses the way we do now, like they were just private property and personal comfort. They talked about dwellings like they were territory, spaces that could be protected or infiltrated, strengthened or weakened, sanctified or neglected. And they didn't claim those spaces only with words. They did it with actions. Not because actions were magical. Because actions were alignment. They understood something we've gotten strange about, that the spiritual life is not confined to the inside of your mind. That obedience isn't only a feeling. That faith, if it is real, touches the physical world. And once I saw that, I couldn't unsee it. Because all throughout Scripture, if you read it like a narrative instead of a decoration, God keeps tying authority to tangible obedience. Not for symbolism. For effect. A mark on a doorway. A stone set up as witness. A boundary established that everyone could see. And suddenly the question that had haunted me became more specific. If the home can be contested, how do you establish a boundary that isn't just emotional determination? That's when salt entered the story. Not as an internet trick. Not as a party trick dressed up as faith. As a pattern. A covenant substance that shows up again and again, not loud, not glamorous, but consistent. Preserving. Marking. Declaring permanence. Refusing corruption. Salt doesn't shout. It doesn't perform. It doesn't sparkle. It simply holds the line. And the more I studied, the more it felt like I was staring at something we all knew once and then forgot because forgetting was more convenient. Modern faith is comfortable with invisible things, thoughts, feelings, intentions. We like the kind of spirituality that stays private and doesn't ask us to do anything that looks strange. But the older faith I kept encountering wasn't interested in looking normal. It was interested in being clean. It was interested in being guarded. It was interested in not leaving the gates open and then acting shocked when something wandered in. When I first considered using salt intentionally, I hesitated. Not because I doubted God. Because I doubted how it would look. That's a real confession, and it's one you might recognize. We don't always fear darkness, we fear embarrassment. We fear being misunderstood. We fear being labeled extreme. So we stay passive. We keep things reasonable. We keep our faith polite. And meanwhile, the atmosphere in the home continues to erode. Do you see the trap? The home is getting attacked quietly, and our primary concern becomes whether defending it would be socially acceptable. That's how territory gets lost. Not through one big surrender. Through 1,000 small delays. It took me longer than I like to admit to reach the second truth. Neutrality is not a safe position. Neutrality is simply unclaimed ground. And unclaimed ground always gets claimed by something else. That's why the stretch from now until Christmas matters. Because you don't just enter a festive season, you enter a season of heightened meaning. You enter a period where light is named out loud more than usual, sung more than usual, spoken more than usual. And darkness doesn't respond to that with indifference. It responds with disruption. Not always with obvious evil. Often with fatigue. With irritation. With decision. With distraction. With the kind of heaviness that makes you stop praying not because you stop believing, but because you're too tired to fight. The aim is rarely to destroy you in one night. The aim is to wear down your authority until you forget you have it. And that's why this isn't about fear. It's about wakefulness. Because the moment you see the pattern, you have a choice. You can keep living like the home is automatically protected because you love God. Or you can start treating the home like what it actually is. A threshold. A place where influence enters. A place where peace must be practiced. A place where boundaries must be established. So when I finally moved from study to action, I didn't do it with drama. I didn't do it with panic. I did it the way you lock a door when you realize you've left it open for months. Calmly. Deliberately. With a quiet anger at my own passivity. Because that's what changed everything for me, the shift from begging for peace to enforcing it. And salt, simple, ordinary salt, became my way of drawing a line I could return to every day. Not as a charm. Not as a replacement for repentance or prayer. But as a physical marker that matched a spiritual decision. This home will not be porous on purpose. But before I tell you where the line must be drawn, before I walk you through the 7 places that tend to leak first, you need to understand the deeper rule behind it all. Because if you miss this, you'll turn a boundary into a routine. You'll place salt like a habit and wonder why the atmosphere doesn't change. The effectiveness isn't in the grains. It's in the authority. And authority doesn't begin in your hands. It begins in how you treat the ground you live on. So let's name the battlefield correctly. Not the church building. Not the internet. Not the city skyline. Your home. The place you sleep. The place you speak. The place you forgive or refuse. The place you rest or stay restless. The place that is either a fortress by intention or a battleground by default. And if that's true, if the home is the first battleground, then the next question becomes unavoidable. Where do you start? Most people start in the wrong place. They start out there. They aim their prayers at the news, at the culture, at the spiritual climate, at the city, at the workplace, at the school system, at the big, shadowy idea of darkness somewhere beyond the walls. They picture warfare as something that happens in arenas, loud places, public places, dramatic places. And it makes sense. It feels cleaner that way. Because if the battlefield is out there, then you can keep your home as a private refuge, neutral, safe, exempt. But the first reversal is the one that almost always offends the comfortable believer. The war doesn't begin in the streets. It begins in the living room. It begins where you take your shoes off. Where you collapse onto the couch. Where you stop performing and start revealing. Where you speak in the tone you'd never use anywhere else. Where you scroll in silence. Where you argue behind closed doors. Where you make decisions that no one applauds and no one corrects. Your home isn't just a place you live. It's the place you become. And that is exactly why it is contested. Because the enemy doesn't need to conquer your city if he can corrode your table. He doesn't need to topple your church if he can poison your sleep. He doesn't need to silence your worship in public if he can drain your strength in private. If he can make your home heavy, he can make your faith tired. If he can make your faith tired, he can make obedience feel optional. If he can make obedience feel optional, he can make compromise feel normal. And that's how a fortress becomes a battleground, quietly. Not with thunder. With erosion. That's the part nobody teaches you when they're trying to keep faith simple. They teach you to believe. They teach you to pray. They teach you to hope. But they don't always teach you to enforce. And enforcement is the daily work of authority. Not the flashy kind. The faithful kind. The kind that shows up in small moments, what you allow, what you excuse, what you leave unaddressed because you're tired, what you keep consuming because you don't want to fight yourself. Every room either resists or cooperates. Not because a room has a personality, but because a room becomes trained. It absorbs patterns. It holds atmosphere. It becomes a stage for repeated choices, anger rehearsed, peace rehearsed, temptation rehearsed, prayer rehearsed. A bedroom can become a sanctuary or a battlefield depending on what is welcomed there. A kitchen can become a place of nourishment or a place of conflict depending on what is spoken there. A living room can become a place of connection or a place of numbness depending on what is fed there. And when you realize that, you realize something else. You can't outsource the guarding of your home. No pastor can lock your doors for you. No sermon can replace your boundaries. No worship playlist can compensate for what you tolerate. You have to begin where you live. That's reversal number 1. And it comes with a strange relief. Because if the battlefield is your home, then the fight is not abstract anymore. It's not a fog. It has a shape. It has a map. It has a beginning. And once I accepted that, I went searching for those who already knew it. Not the loud modern voices. The older ones. The ones who lived close to the edge of the world and refused to live porous. I expected to find superstition. What I found was discipline. Ancient knowledge, modern amnesia. Early Christians didn't talk about the home like it was neutral. They treated it like a place that needed to be kept. Guarded. Claimed. Protected, not because God was weak, but because humans are forgetful. They blessed their dwellings. They marked thresholds. They prayed over entrances. They kept watch, not with fear, but with clarity. If influence can enter, then influence must be challenged. And the monastic communities, people love to romanticize them now as quiet men in robes copying manuscripts, but those communities were built on an understanding modern believers rarely consider. They believed place mattered. Not as a magical concept. As a spiritual reality. They consecrated cells, little rooms where they slept and prayed and battled their own thoughts. They treated a doorway like a boundary, not a decoration. They understood that corners collect more than dust, they collect what is neglected. And the practices weren't fringe. They weren't rare deliverance secrets. They were ordinary discipline, like sweeping a floor, like lighting a lamp, like washing hands before a meal. A home was something you maintained in holiness, the way you maintain a garden against weeds. Not once. Repeatedly. That's what startled me. These weren't people chasing dramatic encounters. They weren't looking for a fight. They were simply unwilling to live unguarded. And it forced me to confront the second twist, the one that modern comfort tries to soften. Faith is not only what you believe inside. Faith is what you obey in the open. Over and over again, Scripture ties spiritual authority to physical action, not because God needs props, but because humans need alignment. Think about how God speaks to people. He doesn't just give them ideas, He gives them instructions that require movement. A mark placed where death would pass over. Stones stacked so future generations would remember. A posture. A step. A lifted hand. A door shut. A boundary drawn. Not theater, obedience. And obedience is never purely internal. It touches the world. It leaves evidence. That's what ritual was supposed to be before it became either superstition or embarrassment. It was responsibility made visible. A way of saying, I do not only agree with truth, I arrange my life around it. Somewhere along the way, modern believers got nervous about that. We started treating any physical expression of spiritual authority like it was automatically suspicious. We wanted faith to stay clean, intangible, private. But the ancient world didn't think like that. They understood something we now call weird, even though it's been true the entire time. The unseen influences the seen, and the seen responds to the unseen. Not by magic, By authority. By alignment. By refusing to live split, saying one thing with your mouth while your environment remains open to what your spirit claims to reject. That's where salt comes back in. Not as an accessory. Not as a charm. As a covenant substance. Salt preserves. It resists decay. It refuses corruption. It draws a line that says, this will not rot quietly. It is ordinary enough to ignore, strong enough to change the way food behaves, and stubborn enough to remain. That's why it's a marker. That's why it's used to seal, to preserve, to bind. Salt is not flashy. It doesn't announce itself. But it works. And it works in the same way boundaries work, by being present, by being consistent, by being clear. Modern discomfort with ritual didn't make us more spiritual. It made us more vague. We traded enforcement for sentiment. We traded boundaries for vibes. We traded authority for optimism. And then we acted surprised when the atmosphere in our homes started to drift. Because here's what nobody wants to admit. If you refuse to guard your environment because you don't want to look extreme, you will eventually live in an environment shaped by whatever had the courage to enter. Something will always fill unclaimed space. And that leads to the hard turn, the part of this chapter that doesn't feel kind, but is. The dangerous lie of neutrality. Neutrality feels safe because it feels like you're avoiding conflict. It feels like maturity. It feels like peacekeeping. But in spiritual reality, neutrality is not peace. Neutrality is permission. Because doing nothing is still choosing. Not choosing a side doesn't remove you from the fight, it removes your defenses. Delay doesn't pause the pressure. It gives it time to settle. And pressure loves time. Time is how it becomes normal. At first, the heaviness feels unusual. Then it becomes just how December is. At first, the arguments feel shocking. Then they become just how we talk. At first, the cold distance feels alarming. Then it becomes just how marriage is. At first, the restless sleep feels spiritual. Then it becomes just anxiety. This is how invasion becomes invisible. Not because it stops. Because you stop recognizing it as foreign. And that's why the season matters. From now until Christmas, you're not only counting down to a date, you're moving through a corridor of increasing spiritual noise. More gatherings. More stress. More memories. More temptation to numb out. More pressure on relationships. And the enemy doesn't need you to renounce faith. He only needs you to go passive. He only needs you to say, I'll deal with it after the holidays. Because after the holidays is one of the most expensive phrases a household can speak. It sounds reasonable. But it functions like surrender. So here is the line you have to cross, and it's not a line of fear, it's a line of clarity. If your home is contested, it must be defended. Not with panic. Not with obsession. With intention. With actions that match your prayers. With boundaries that reflect your authority. This is where the story stops being theoretical. Because you can nod at everything I'm saying and remain unchanged. You can agree and still leave the doors open. You can feel stirred and still go back to the same patterns by morning. That's why I won't leave you in the fog. You won't be left guessing. You won't be asked to just be more spiritual without being shown what that looks like in a house with real people, real schedules, and real fatigue. The defense of a home is not one dramatic moment. It is a sequence of small, deliberate claims made where life actually happens. And SALT, simple, visible, enforceable, becomes one of those claims. Not the only one. Not a replacement for repentance, forgiveness, or obedience. But a line in the sand that says, this atmosphere will not be shaped by neglect. So now we come to the only question that matters. If the home is the battlefield, where does the battle begin? It begins the moment you stop treating your house like a backdrop. The moment you stop moving through rooms on autopilot and start seeing what they really are, spaces of agreement. Places where things are either welcomed or resisted. Corners where the atmosphere gathers. Thresholds where influence enters. That night, when I finally stood up and decided I wasn't going to keep enduring in my own home, something changed before I placed anything at all. Not the air in me. Because a guarded home doesn't start with SALT. It starts with a decision. I walked slowly, like someone learning their house again. Not with fear. With awareness. As if I had been living inside a map I'd never bothered to read. And that's when the house became a tactical layout. Not in a paranoid way, just in an honest one. Every home has weak points. Every household has gates. Every family has routines that create openings if they're left unguarded long enough. The invasion is never just somewhere in the house. It always settles in patterns. It makes nests in repetition. So I stopped asking, why does this feel heavy, and started asking, where does it hit first? Where does it gather? Where does it win small victories that lead to bigger ones? And as I traced it, the answer became locatable. There were places where peace should have lived naturally, but didn't. There were places where arguments tended to start like matches striking in the same spot. There were places where rest should have been automatic, but felt interrupted. And I realized something that sounds obvious once you see it. A home can't be defended as a single object. It has to be defended as a set of thresholds. So I got SALT, not with theatrics, not with superstition. Just SALT. Ordinary. Clean. Uncomplicated. And I began to walk. Not like someone doing a ritual. Like someone drawing boundaries. 1. The front door, authority over access. I started where everything starts, the main entrance. Because the front door is not just a piece of wood with a lock. It is the primary agreement point of the household. It is where the outside world hands you what it has: stress, offense, temptation, fear, bad news, comparison, pressure, and you carry it inside without realizing you're carrying it. How many times have you walked through your front door with your jaw clenched? With resentment in your chest? With dread following you like a shadow? And then wondered why the atmosphere shifted the moment you arrived? A door is a gate. And gates must be governed. So I marked it, not dramatically. A small placement, deliberate, A boundary. A quiet declaration in my spirit. What enters here must submit to the peace of Christ. What does not belong cannot remain. And something about starting there mattered. Because when you claim the main gate, you're announcing that your house is not open territory. It is not a public square. It is not a dumping ground for whatever the day dragged in. It is a dwelling under authority. 2. The back door, the forgotten access point. Then I went to the door everyone forgets. The side entrance. The back door. The one you use when your hands are full. The one you don't think about because it's just the back. And that's exactly why it matters. Because spiritual intrusion rarely comes through what you're watching carefully. It comes through what you assume is fine. This is where overlooked compromises hide. The little things you never address. The habits you keep excusing. The relationships you tolerate because confronting them feels inconvenient. The back door is the picture of casual access. So I marked it too. Not because I thought darkness was physically standing outside my porch waiting to sprint in, but because I understood the principle: what is unguarded becomes easy, and easy becomes normal. I set the boundary and felt a strange sense of order, like a loose thread had been tied off. 3. The bedrooms: rest, dreams, intimacy, fear. From there I went where the mind becomes most vulnerable. Bedrooms are holy ground whether you treat them that way or not. Because sleep lowers defenses. Dreams become loud. Thoughts wander. The body rests, but the spirit can feel exposed, especially when the household has been under pressure. This is where nightmares show up. This is where insomnia becomes a weapon. This is where intimacy can be strained, where distance grows quietly, where temptation whispers in private. If the enemy can disturb your rest, he can disturb your strength. If he can disturb your strength, he can disturb your patience. If he can disturb your patience, he can disturb your relationships. It's never random. So I mark the bedrooms, not just the children's, but mine too. Because adults pretend they don't have night battles, but that's often where the fiercest ones live: anxiety that spikes at 2 a.m., shame that speaks in the dark, regret that replays itself like a loop. And as I did it, I didn't speak loudly. I spoke clearly, internally, firmly. This is a place of rest. This is a place of peace. This is not a playground for torment. That's what boundaries are: clarity where there was once drift. 4. With a kitchen, provision, conversation, unity. Then I went to the heart. The kitchen is where the household is fed, not only with food, but with words. It's where routines happen. It's where small talk turns into arguments because everyone is tired and hungry. It's where families reconnect or fracture depending on what the table becomes. Provision is spiritual. So is conversation. A kitchen can nourish a home or poison it without anyone realizing. Sarcasm. Criticism. Coldness. Silent resentment. The kind of jokes that cut. If the enemy can corrupt the table, he can corrupt unity. I marked the kitchen because I wanted it to become what it was meant to be: a place of nourishment, not contention. A place where food isn't the only thing offered, where kindness can be offered too. And that was the first moment I felt something lift. Not like a movie. Like a shoulder relaxing that has been tense for weeks. 5. The windows, perception, exposure, influence. Then I move to the openings you don't think of as gates. Windows. They let light in. They let air in. They let you see out. They also represent what you allow to influence your perception. What comes through your eyes matters. What you stare at matters. What you keep in view shapes the interior of your life. Some homes have open windows that should never be open, screens always on, doom always playing, entertainment always streaming, noise always filling the space because silence feels too revealing. A window can be light or exposure. So I marked the windows, not every single pane, but the principle of them. And I made a quiet commitment as I did, not just to place salt, but to guard what entered my mind through what I watched, what I consumed, what I kept scrolling past midnight. Because you can't pray for peace and feed yourself poison. That's not warfare. That's contradiction. 6. The bathroom, for shame, private battles, self-accusation. Then I went to the most private room. The place where people go alone. And that's why it matters. Bathrooms are where shame likes to speak because no one else is present. It's where you look in the mirror and hear accusations. It's where compulsions can hide. It's where people cry quietly so nobody asks questions. It's where the private war often reveals itself. And shame is one of the enemy's favorite tools because shame doesn't just make you feel bad, it makes you hide. It makes you isolate. It makes you silent. So I marked that space too, not because I thought the tiles were cursed, but because I wanted no room in my home to become a confessional for condemnation. This house will not host accusation. And I meant it. 7. The center of the home, the seat of authority. Last, I went to the center. Not always the geometric center, but the felt center, the place the home gathers around. The living room. The main hallway. The table. The spot where the family most often exists together. Because every home has a seat. A core. And the question is simple. Who governs it? Not who owns the mortgage. Who governs the atmosphere? The center is where conflict becomes contagious or where peace spreads outward. It's where the home either feels safe or feels sharp. It's where everyone senses the tone the moment they walk in. So I mark the center with a deliberate calm and something close to holy anger. This is the seat of authority in this house. Not fear. Not resentment. Not distraction. Peace belongs here. And that was the march. 7 boundaries. Not a checklist. A reclaiming. But here's where the chapter tightens, because if I stop the story there, you might think the salt itself is the key. It isn't. Salt can mark a boundary. But it cannot replace integrity. And this is where people get hurt, because they try to use a physical act to cover a spiritual contradiction. They want a guarded house while keeping an unguarded heart. They want protection while nursing bitterness. They want peace while feeding secret indulgence. They want authority while refusing repentance. They want the atmosphere to change while refusing to change what they tolerate. Salt without alignment becomes routine. And routine without obedience becomes hollow. You cannot draw a line in your hallway while living lineless in your private life. Because the real battlefield isn't only your home. It's your agreements. What you refuse to forgive. What you keep excusing. What you consume when no one sees. What you entertain in your mind and call it just thoughts. What you speak in your house and justify because you're stressed. That's where authority is either strengthened or drained. Authority doesn't flow from volume. It flows from consistency. From the quiet decision to live in alignment with what you claim. So I had to do both. I placed salt. And I confronted what made my home porous. I stopped pretending certain resentments were harmless. I broke agreement with compromises I had normalized. I took ownership of the atmosphere I helped create with my tone, my habits, my avoidance. That was the secondary climax, the one nobody posts about because it's not dramatic. It's humbling. But it works. And then something began to shift. Not instantly. Not like a lightning strike. More like dawn. The first thing I noticed was night. The nights got quieter. Not perfect, just quieter. Fewer sudden awakenings. Less of that sense of watchfulness. The kind of sleep that doesn't feel like you're bracing for something. Then I noticed the conversations. Arguments didn't disappear, but they softened faster. Apologies came easier. That edge wasn't always waiting in the next sentence. The house felt lighter, not euphoric, just breathable. And that's when I understood what real reclaiming looks like. Peace returns the way it left, gradually. Inches at a time. Through repeated choices that tell the atmosphere, you don't govern here anymore. And this is the point where you need to see yourself differently. Not as a victim of an unseen problem. Not as a passive observer hoping things improve. But as the guardian of your threshold. Because the home is not neutral ground. It never was. So here is the declaration that closed that season for me, and can close it for you too. From now until Christmas, this house is claimed. Not by superstition. Not by fear. Not by performance. By authority. By alignment. By boundaries enforced in ordinary places. The invasion is denied. The gates are guarded. The line has been drawn. And the next step is simple, because you already have the map. Start at the first gate. And walk. Before you go, subscribe, drop a comment with where you're watching from, and share your thoughts.